Jessica Parker sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, surrounded by the echoes of a life that felt increasingly distant. The walls were lined with framed photographs, capturing moments from a past filled with laughter and companionship. There was a picture from her college graduation, where she stood with her best friends, arms around each other, their futures bright and full of promise. Another photo showed a group of them on a beach vacation, carefree and sun-kissed, the world at their feet. Wedding photos of her friends beamed back at her, showcasing the joy and hope that had filled those special days. Baby showers and birthday parties completed the gallery, a timeline of the lives of those around her. But as Jessica stared at these images, a deep sense of isolation washed over her. Each picture, once a reminder of happier times, now seemed to mock her. She was 42, single, and living a life that felt increasingly empty. The friends who had once been her entire world were now caught up in their own, married, with children, careers and homes filled with the chaos of family life. Their days were spent juggling work meetings, school events, and family dinners, while Jessica's life had dwindled down to quiet evenings alone in her apartment. Jessica wasn't bitter, but the loneliness was a constant, gnawing presence. It wasn't just the lack of a partner that weighed on her. It was the absence of connection, the feeling that she had somehow fallen behind while everyone else had moved on. The once lively phone calls with her friends had become sporadic, reduced to quick catch-ups, squeezed in between their busy schedules. Invitations to gatherings had become rare, and when they did come, she often found herself as the odd one out, the single woman amidst a sea of couples and families. Her 30s had passed in a blur of hopeful anticipation. She had dated, tried to find the right person, but as the years slipped by, the right person never materialized. Jessica had always imagined that by now she would be settled, maybe even have a child or two. But instead, she was here, in her early 40s, still single, and more alone than ever. The quiet of her apartment on a Saturday night was deafening, a stark contrast to the lives unfolding around her. Jessica often spent her weekends in front of the TV, watching others live out the kind of love stories she had once dreamed of. It wasn't just the fictional romances that made her ache with longing. It was the reality shows, the news stories about couples celebrating decades of marriage, the social media posts from friends showcasing their perfect families. Each one was a reminder of what she didn't have, what she might never have. One evening, after yet another weekend spent in solitude, Jessica found herself overwhelmed by the fear that had been lurking in the corners of her mind for years. The fear that she would never find someone to share her life with, that she would grow old alone, with no one to hold her hand, to share her days, to be her partner in life. It was a fear that had grown stronger with each passing year, and now, at 42, it felt like a crushing weight on her chest. The thought of spending the rest of her life alone terrified her. She couldn't bear it, couldn't stand the thought of watching more years slip away without someone by her side. That evening, as she sat in the dim light of her apartment, Jessica made a decision. She would do whatever it took to find someone, anyone, who would love her. She would not let herself fade into the background, forgotten and alone. She didn't care about the details anymore. She just wanted someone to fill the emptiness that had settled into her heart. Desperation, like a dark cloud, settled over her. She would find a man, no matter what it took, because anything was better than the crushing loneliness she felt every single day. Determined not to let the fear of being alone consume her, Jessica threw herself into the dating scene with a vigor that caught even her off guard. She spent hours crafting the perfect online dating profiles, carefully selecting photos that highlighted her best features and writing descriptions that showcased her wit, intelligence, and warm personality. Despite her insecurities, she believed that somewhere out there, a man would see beyond the surface and appreciate the woman she truly was. The first few dates, however, quickly shattered that belief. On her very first date, Jessica met Mark, a man who seemed charming in his online messages. But in person, it was a different story. The moment they sat down at the restaurant, Mark barely glanced at her, his attention fixed on his phone. He checked his emails, scrolled through social media, and only occasionally mumbled a response when Jessica tried to start a conversation. She left that dinner feeling invisible, wondering if she had somehow done something wrong. Undeterred, Jessica agreed to another date, this time with a man named Tony. He was a bit older, in his late 40s, and they had exchanged pleasant messages about their shared love for classical music. But when Tony saw her at the coffee shop, the disappointment in his eyes was impossible to miss. He barely masked his disinterest, offering only half-hearted compliments and avoiding eye contact. They sat through an awkward hour of small talk before Tony made a hurried excuse to leave, not even bothering to suggest a second date. Jessica drove home in silence that night, the sting of rejection cutting deep. The third date gave her a glimmer of hope. David, a man in his early 50s, seemed genuinely interested in her. They laughed over dinner, shared stories about their careers, and for the first time, Jessica felt a connection forming. But as the evening came to a close, David hesitated. He finally admitted that he wasn't looking for anything serious, just casual companionship. The words hit Jessica like a punch to the gut. She had hoped for something more, something real, but it was clear that David didn't see her as a long-term partner. As Jessica reflected on these encounters, she couldn't help but notice a pattern. Despite her efforts to present herself as confident and capable, she could see the disappointment in her date's eyes when they met her. It was as if they had expected someone younger, slimmer, someone without the quiet desperation she couldn't quite hide. Jessica had always been aware of her age and her weight, but these dates magnified those insecurities, making her feel like less of a woman, less deserving of love. It wasn't that Jessica lacked confidence entirely. She knew she had a lot to offer. She was kind, intelligent, and had built a successful career in marketing, climbing the ranks to a senior position through hard work and dedication. Her colleagues respected her, and she was known for her creative ideas and strong work ethic. But in the world of dating, none of that seemed to matter. What men seemed to focus on was her age, her appearance, and the subtle signs of her yearning for a relationship. The things she was most proud of were overlooked, and what they saw instead was a woman who had been left behind by life. After months of failed dates, Jessica's hope began to wane. She had put herself out there, given it her all, but the constant rejection was taking its toll. Each new date became more of a challenge, with her heart growing heavier from the accumulated disappointments. The once bright spark of optimism that had driven her to dive into the dating pool was now dim, flickering weakly in the face of reality. She began to wonder if love was simply not in the cards for her, if she was meant to navigate life alone. Yet, despite the growing doubt, Jessica couldn't bring herself to give up entirely. The thought of spending the rest of her life alone was too painful to bear, so she pushed that fear aside and continued searching, even as each new rejection added another layer of hurt to her already wounded heart. The dream of finding someone to share her life with was too powerful to let go, even as it seemed to slip further and further out of reach. It was a cold, rainy evening when Jessica had the encounter that would change her life forever. She had just finished another miserable blind date at a small cafe downtown, one that had gone as badly as the others. Her date, a man named Greg, had been polite enough, but clearly disinterested from the moment they sat down. The conversation had been forced, with long, awkward pauses, and by the end of the evening, Jessica couldn't wait to leave. The rain poured down heavily as she hurried to her car, her mind racing with self-doubt and frustration. She cursed herself for even bothering with the date, feeling like a fool for continuing to put herself through these painful experiences. As she reached for her car keys, she noticed a figure huddled in the doorway of a nearby building. The man was thin, his clothes dirty and soaked through from the rain. His face was partially hidden beneath a tattered hood, but there was something about him that caught Jessica's attention. The way he sat there, curled up and shivering, struck a chord deep within her. Despite the numbness she felt from the repeated rejections, a small spark of compassion ignited inside her. Without thinking, Jessica walked over to the man, her footsteps splashing in the puddles that had formed on the sidewalk. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice filled with genuine concern. The man looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and weariness. He hadn't expected anyone to notice him, let alone approach him. "Just trying to stay dry," he replied, his voice raspy from the cold and lack of use. Jessica felt a pang of sympathy as she looked into his eyes. They were eyes that had seen hard times, eyes that held a sadness she recognized all too well. She had seen homeless people around the city before, but she had never stopped to talk to one. This man, however, seemed different. There was a depth to his despair that resonated with her own feelings of loneliness and isolation. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Jessica asked, her heart aching at the thought of him spending the night out in the cold. He shook his head slowly. "No. Been on the streets for a while now," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the wet pavement as if ashamed to look her in the eyes. Jessica hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with thoughts. What was she doing, talking to a complete stranger on the street? But something about this man, this moment, felt significant. She couldn't just walk away and leave him there. "Come with me," she said suddenly, her voice firmer than she expected. "I'll get you something to eat and some dry clothes." The man looked at her in disbelief, his expression one of cautious hope. "You don't have to do that," he said, though his voice was tinged with a desperation he couldn't quite hide. "I want to," Jessica insisted, her tone softening. "Please, let me help." He hesitated for a moment longer, as if unsure whether to trust her. But then, with a slow nod, he accepted her offer. Together, they walked to her car, the rain still falling around them like a curtain separating them from the rest of the world. As they drove through the dark, wet streets toward her apartment, Jessica learned that his name was Ethan. He had once been an ordinary man, living a life not so different from her own, but a series of unfortunate events, losing his job, the death of a close family member, and the collapse of his savings, had led him down a path he never could have anticipated. Now, he had been living on the streets for nearly a year, each day a struggle for survival. Jessica felt an overwhelming sense of compassion for Ethan as she listened to his story. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to have no one and nothing, to be completely alone in the world. In a way, she realized they were both lost, her in her search for love, and him in his battle for survival. As they pulled up to her apartment building, Jessica made a decision that surprised even herself. She would help Ethan get back on his feet, no matter what it took. Maybe, just maybe, they could be what each other needed. As they stepped out of the car and into the warmth of her apartment, Jessica felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't the kind of hope she had been searching for, the hope of finding love in the traditional sense. But it was something, and in that moment, it was enough. When Jessica opened her door to Ethan, she wasn't just offering shelter from the cold. She was giving him a chance to rebuild his life. She knew what it felt like to be lost and alone, and she didn't want Ethan to face that any longer. Over the next few days, Jessica helped Ethan clean up, bought him new clothes, and introduced him to the comforts of a warm meal and a safe place to sleep. For the first time in a long while, Ethan began to feel like he was regaining control over his life. Ethan's gratitude was evident in everything he did. He was meticulous about keeping Jessica's apartment tidy, often waking up early to make breakfast or tidy up before she even noticed. Jessica appreciated the effort, and her heart softened toward him more with each passing day. They spent evenings talking about their lives, sharing stories from their pasts, and gradually, the walls that both had built around their hearts started to come down. Jessica learned that Ethan had once been a successful accountant with a promising career, but life had thrown him into a downward spiral. His parents had passed away within months of each other, and the grief had driven him to make poor decisions. He lost his job, and without a safety net, he eventually ended up on the streets. Hearing Ethan's story, Jessica couldn't help but feel a deep connection to him. She too had faced disappointments and loneliness, albeit in a different way. As the months rolled on, their bond grew stronger. Ethan, bolstered by Jessica's support, began to apply for jobs. With her help, he landed a position as a junior accountant at a small firm. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and it gave Ethan a renewed sense of purpose. Jessica was overjoyed to see him regain confidence, and she felt proud of the role she had played in his transformation. He started to look healthier, happier, and more secure in his life. Every time he came home from work with a smile on his face, Jessica's heart swelled with affection. Ethan, in turn, expressed his gratitude in ways that made Jessica feel valued and loved. He often surprised her with small, thoughtful gestures, fresh flowers on the kitchen table, a handwritten note left by her bedside, or a quiet evening walk under the stars. He told her time and again how much she meant to him, how he couldn't have made it without her, and how grateful he was for everything she had done. These moments solidified in Jessica's mind that Ethan was the partner she had been searching for all these years. He wasn't perfect, but neither was she, and together they seemed to fit. However, not everyone saw things the way Jessica did. Her parents, who had always been protective, expressed their concerns about her relationship with Ethan. They worried that she was moving too fast and cautioned her about the potential risks of tying her life to someone with such a troubled past. A few friends, those who still kept in touch, echoed similar sentiments. They feared that Ethan might be taking advantage of Jessica's kindness and vulnerability. But Jessica refused to listen. She believed in Ethan, in the love they had built together, and in the future they could have. She had spent too many years alone, searching for a connection that had always seemed just out of reach. Now that she had found it, she wasn't about to let go. After a year of dating, during a quiet evening at home, Ethan proposed to Jessica. His voice was shaky, and his hands trembled as he held out a simple ring. Jessica didn't hesitate. She eagerly accepted, tears of joy streaming down her face. The proposal might not have been grand, but it was heartfelt, and to Jessica, that was all that mattered. They had a small wedding, attended only by a handful of people. Jessica's parents were there, though they remained cautious in their smiles. A few of her friends attended, wearing polite expressions that hinted at their lingering doubts. But for Jessica, none of that mattered. As she looked into Ethan's eyes and said her vows, she felt that her life was finally coming together. She was married, she was loved, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged. The early days of Jessica and Ethan's marriage were filled with hope and promise. Jessica clung to the belief that she had finally found her happily ever after. But as the weeks turned into months, the reality of their relationship began to unravel. The honeymoon phase, once filled with warmth and affection, faded quickly, replaced by a growing sense of unease. At first, the changes were subtle. Ethan started coming home later and later, always with a vague excuse about work or meeting up with friends. He was no longer the attentive, grateful man Jessica had fallen in love with. Instead, he became distant, almost cold, his once affectionate demeanor replaced with indifference. Jessica tried to convince herself that it was just the stress of his new job or the adjustment to married life, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. One evening, Jessica prepared a special dinner, hoping to rekindle the connection they once shared. She spent hours cooking Ethan's favorite meal, setting the table with the finest china they had received as a wedding gift. But as the hours ticked by and the food grew cold, her hope began to wane. When Ethan finally walked through the door, it was well past midnight, and the smell of perfume clung to him like a guilty secret. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to keep her voice steady. "Where have you been, Ethan?" she asked, trying to mask the hurt with a calm tone. Ethan barely looked at her as he shrugged out of his coat. "Just out with some friends from work," he replied, avoiding her gaze. Jessica's stomach churned with a mix of fear and suspicion. "You smell like perfume," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan paused, then turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It's nothing, Jessica. You're overreacting." But Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The nagging doubts that had been festering for weeks finally came to the surface. "Ethan, please tell me the truth," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "Are you seeing someone else?" For a moment, Ethan's eyes flickered with something. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. You want the truth?" "Yes. I've been seeing other women," he confessed, his tone devoid of any remorse. "But don't act so surprised. You knew this wasn't going to last forever." Jessica felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. The room seemed to spin as she struggled to process his words. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "After everything I've done for you." Ethan's expression hardened. "Don't make this about you, Jessica. I never asked you to take me in, and I certainly didn't ask you to fall in love with me. I'm done with this marriage. I want a divorce." The words hit Jessica like a punch to the gut. She had sacrificed so much for Ethan. Her time, her energy, her love, only to be cast aside like she meant nothing. The final blow came when Ethan coldly informed her that the apartment, the home she had so lovingly created for them, now belonged to him. The prenuptial agreement she had signed without a second thought ensured that she would leave with nothing. As Jessica packed her belongings, each item she placed in the suitcase felt like a piece of her shattered heart. She replayed the events of the past year in her mind, searching for the moment when everything had gone wrong. She had ignored the warnings from her parents, the doubts expressed by her friends, all because she had been so desperate to find love. And now, standing on the threshold of the life she had lost, Jessica realized the painful truth. She had been blinded by her own need for companionship, and in the end, it had cost her everything. With tears streaming down her face, Jessica took one last look at the apartment that had once been her sanctuary. It was no longer hers, just like Ethan was no longer the man she thought she knew. As she walked out the door, she couldn't help but wonder how she had let things get this far. She had given her all, only to be betrayed in the worst possible way. Now, all she had left was the overwhelming emptiness that had brought her to Ethan in the first place. Jessica moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, far from the home she had once shared with Ethan. It was modest and lacked the charm of her previous place, but it was within her new tight budget. The walls were plain, and the furniture was sparse, reflecting the stark reality of her fresh start. The days following the move were among the darkest of her life. Jessica felt overwhelmed by a profound sense of betrayal and loss. Every morning, she woke up in a place that didn't feel like home, surrounded by boxes that still needed to be unpacked. The memories of her failed marriage haunted her, and she felt like a fool for having been deceived by the man she had helped rebuild his life. She cut off all contact with Ethan. Her phone remained silent, and her email was free of his messages. The thought of seeing him happy with someone else while she grappled with her own heartache was unbearable. She avoided places where she might run into him, and she tried to shut out the world that had once been so familiar to her. Her parents and friends reached out, offering their support and understanding. They called, sent messages, and even dropped by her new apartment, hoping to offer comfort. But Jessica felt too ashamed to face them. She had dismissed their warnings about Ethan and now had to confront the reality of her poor choices alone. It was several months before Jessica began to see a therapist. Her sessions provided a safe space to unpack her feelings of anger, sadness, and regret. The therapist helped her understand the root of her choices and guided her through the process of self-forgiveness. Slowly, with each session, Jessica began to piece her life back together. Jessica understood that finding love again would take time, but she believed that someone who truly cared for her would come into her life eventually. She learned to value herself more deeply, appreciating her own strength and resilience. Though she wasn't sure when or where she would meet that special person, she remained optimistic. The journey had been difficult, but it had also made her stronger. Jessica looked forward to a future where she could share her life with someone who would cherish her